So, good morning and afternoon, colleagues. Let me extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Issue-Based Coalition on Environment and Climate Change and its three co-chair organizations, UNECE, UNEP, and UNESCO. Thank you very much for joining us for the training. This is the fourth webinar in this training series on approaches and tools for mainstreaming environment and climate change in United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation frameworks, focusing today on Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. We have received about 50 registrations, and we are delighted to have such a good representation. Many thanks also for answering our questions on mainstreaming prior to the training. This has been very helpful for us in developing the program to make sure the training is really demand-driven. The guidance on mainstreaming environment and climate change in UNSDCFs is the product of a fruitful collaboration between the 18 member agencies of the coalition, with the support of colleagues at DCO, whom I would like to take the opportunity to thank for their support. The guidance was released last June, and at the launch event in July, we anticipated the upcoming training, events which are now taking place, on how to use the guidance. And at that time, we consulted country teams about the focus of the training. We had a good discussion and helpful feedback. The guidance responds to the request by resident coordinators in the European Central Asia region. The overall purpose of the mainstreaming guidance is to support the integration of the environment and climate change in the UNSDCF programming cycle. The guidance looks at mainstreaming in common country analyses and cooperation frameworks within specific sectors and cross-cutting areas. And entry points are identified for mainstreaming, including the country framework roadmap, the common country analyses, and the cooperation framework design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. The guidance provides a key set of recommendations, good practices, as well as approaches and tools and guiding questions or checklists. So we hope that it is a practical tool and useful to you. The first training event of this series, which was held in December last year, introduced the guidance and provided opportunities on knowledge sharing within and across the three sub-regions on mainstreaming environment and climate change in UNSDCF processes. A wide range of colleagues from country teams from most UN program countries in the Pan-European region attended that first event. And you could find the recording of the first meeting in the invitation for today's session. The training that you are attending today focuses on Eastern Europe and the Caucasus and is part of a series of 3 sub-regional level trainings which are being held in January. The first such session focused on the 5 Central Asian states. That was 2 weeks ago. Then last week, we had a session for Southeastern Europe and Turkey. And after today's session, all the results from the 3 sub-regional training sessions will be shared with all of you, all of the participants in the 3 events. Today's training session aims to increase your understanding of the entry points and practical approaches and tools for mainstreaming environment and climate change into UNSDCFs. We have structured today's session to be as interactive as possible, and we look forward to your active participation. So please speak up. It will make it much more interesting and enjoyable for all of us and more valuable. And as you know, we learn more when we interact. So in a moment, our training facilitators from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, will provide an overview of the workshop and the objective of the training. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank our colleagues from IISD and our consultant, Henrietta Martonakova, for working with us to develop this training workshop. With this, I would like to invite Livia. I hope you are there. Yes, good. from IISD to provide an overview of the webinar for today. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the next couple of hours. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, my name is Livia Bizikova, and I am with the International Institute for Sustainable Development based in Ottawa, Canada. And with my colleague Darren Swanson and Leslie Pass, we are really pleased and happy to be coordinating and facilitating this webinar. As it was said before, this is the second webinar following up on part one, which dealt with the overall entry points to mainstreaming and issues and specific examples from the regions. And now today we are looking to get more practical and really look at tools and approaches, how to mainstream with a lot of examples. And also we will be doing a deep dive into two types of tools, focusing on risk-related issues and implementation and measuring and indicators that will be part of the process. So for us at ISD, it's been a great pleasure to working with all of you and your colleagues in the previous sessions to discuss different aspects of mainstreaming. At ISD, we've been working on mainstreaming for many years in different regions of the world, and it's really great to see your interest in the regions, the depths of knowledge, and kind of the interest to participate and work with us through mainstreaming issues. So today, on this slide, you can see the agenda for today, and we will be, obviously we are in the opening part of the agenda. There will be a presentation by the consultant Henrietta Martonakova describing the critical elements that were outlined in the guidebook. And then we discussed today, we are facing some international challenges in multiple internet challenges in multiple countries. So we decided that maybe we won't be able to have two working groups separately, but we will run the issues that are covered in those working groups one after another. So we will first focus on the risk analysis and linkages to inform cooperation frameworks, design and implementation, and then we look at results framework and how to think about designing indicators for cooperation framework. And this kind of request we actually received from the previous webinars when people felt that both sessions are very interesting and they would prefer to have an opportunity to attend both of them. So in this case, you will have the opportunity to actually get a deeper insight on both of the issues. And then because all the process will happen in plenary, we will have just a very brief recap as a synthesis at the end, and then we will have closing remarks. And with that, I'm handing over to my colleague, Darren Swanson, who is a long-term associate with IISD, who has done many projects related to mainstreaming, sustainable development, and lately SDGs. And he will be now facilitating this part of the workshop.
Thank you very much, Livia, and welcome colleagues from across the region, and good day. Our event today is going to be interactive in a number of different ways. We are going to have a few polls throughout and a poll at the end, I guess, for evaluation. We're going to have a few quiz questions throughout just to test some knowledge acquired during the sessions. We will have some Q&A periods, and as Livia noted, we will be staying in plenary for the breakout rooms, but you will have the same content as if we were moving into the breakout rooms. Just a bit of context before we go a little bit further now. When you registered for the event, you did provide some information, some context, and one of those was about the issues that were top of mind for you in your cooperation framework process. These were the issues of concern. And we compiled all those from across all the registrants here in the webinar. And as you can see on the screen, land degradation was a common thematic issue mentioned across the region, and as well climate change adaptation was also mentioned quite frequently. But as you can see, a lot of different types of issues across the region, a lot dealing with different aspects of climate change, of course, but we've got issues of deforestation, Drought was of concern, green transition, green economy, even soil degradation, and a lot of natural resource management, even integrated water resources management. So a cluster of issues that you are all addressing across the region, and hence, I guess, the imperative for the mainstreaming discussion that we're having today, and the guidance document that was prepared by the IVC. Another question that was asked in the registration process was about where within the cooperation framework process were you most interested in receiving additional guidance and support with regard to mainstreaming environment and climate change into cooperation frameworks. And these represent different entry points. And as you can see here, the bulk of the responses were of interest in the implementation phase of the cooperation framework, monitoring, evaluation, and also design and common country analysis, similarly speaking. So today's event, and this was a similar sort of result from the previous sub-regional workshop, the other two. So we have added focus in this event to the implementation and monitoring and evaluation stages, which are reflected in the thematic areas. So that's a bit of a sub-regional overview. And just to set a little context. And without further ado, we want to get through the details of the guidance document on mainstreaming that you've all been provided and was the subject of the first webinar back in December at a higher level. And we're pleased to again have today Henrietta Martinikova, who was the lead and coordinating author for that publication. And Henrietta is an environmental governance and impact assessment specialist, and she's based in the Slovak Republic. She's got a lot of experience with strategic environmental assessment, poverty, environment nexus, mainstreaming, analyzing gender and environment and energy linkages, and with measures for the green post-COVID-19 recovery in the ECA region. Henrietta, thank you very much, and for again taking us through some of the details with regard to approaches and tools for mainstreaming environment and climate change. Henrietta.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Darren, very much. As Darren has already mentioned, the majority of this training is supposed to be devoted to the interactive part. So you participants have a chance to share your experience, to ask questions, to maybe do some practical exercises. So I would basically just quickly run you through some examples of tools and approaches. If you would like to learn more, please ask questions when there is a time for it, or pose your questions into the chat, or ask questions even after the workshop. And I encourage you read the guidance itself, because it includes lots of examples based on the review of the 10 new CCAs and 13 new CCAs and 10 cooperation framework documents from the region. I would show the examples of approaches and tools related to all entry points of the UN programming. Before I go to the examples of the tools, I would like to stress there is no single best approach or method. Therefore, as in the guidance and today, I would present just a very small percentage or very few examples of methods and tools that could be used in the mainstreaming. Whatever method you select, it is basically determined by the programming process and by the type of the programming document you are mainstreaming in. So, for example, in terms of level of details, you would use different approach in mainstreaming to the CCA or CF document, and mainstreaming to the project document that is related, for example, to the infrastructure, where we would have to use more technical methods. Just as in elaboration of CCA and cooperation framework document itself, there is where they are supposed to be developed within 6 to 9 months, which is not a long time. Also, in terms of mainstreaming, you would use existing data and information, because you would have no time to run surveys or research for primary data. And of course, the compendium for cooperation framework design already includes number of approaches and tools. So for mainstreaming environment and climate change into them, you just, in many cases, you just extend application of those tools by feeding in environment and climate change related data. And last but not least, not to prolong and overcomplicate the design of CCA or a cooperation framework document, you are encouraged to use the simplest possible methods which are time and cost effective. A very short stop at the stage of the roadmap preparation. One of the important steps is to identify the right stakeholders for the design of CCA and cooperation framework. In terms of mainstreaming, try to make sure you involve stakeholders that can both push for environment and climate change agenda, but can also bring expertise. You identify what their role should be in different stages of the UN programming and by which methods and approaches you would like to involve them. Also very important stage in the roadmap is to make the case for environment and climate change. So basically to show that there is a strong link between situation in climate change and environmental conditions and social and economic development and human well-being. So try to bring simple messages, but based on the verifiable resources in the form of infographics, policy briefs, fact sheets, and so on. Mainstreaming in the CCA, Common Country Analysis, a very important stage. The key step in terms of mainstreaming for the whole process of CCA elaboration and cooperation framework is to identify synergies or linkages between the country priority or specific environment and climate change issues and country specific important development issues. For this, you can just use a very simple synergies matrix as shown in the slide, where by number 0, you show that there is, for example, very weak, or there is basically no linkage between those issues. So you do not have to deal with that issue further throughout the UN programming process. And by number 1, you identify the links which you have to address in both in the CCA and cooperation framework document. In the CCA, in the section where you identify the country's priorities and commitments, please do so also for priorities and commitments related to environment and climate change for your country. This is usually the case in many CCAs, but besides identifying to what international or regional multilateral environmental agreements, for example, country is obliged to comply with, please try to include also the concrete and, if possible, quantitative commitments. This stage is also very important because when you design your cooperation framework document, it is important to cross-reference your objectives in other development areas in social, economic, education with those environmental commitments and objectives. Next slide, please. In the CCA, when you assess the progress on status of SDGs and targets related that are priority for your country, please, if possible, and if you have data, assess also the targets related to the environment and climate change for those SDGs that are not specifically referring to environment and climate change. In the slide, you see example, for example, in SDG 5, which is related to gender equality, where in a particular CCA country provides data on how many landowners in agriculture are women. Or, for example, SDG 16, as is the good governance, the particular CCA emphasizes the importance of Aarhus Convention because it promotes free public access to information and public participation in environmental decision-making and environmental justice. So in this particular CCA, country assesses what is the stage of implementation of this convention. A very important part of the CCA is risk assessment. Here again, in terms of mainstreaming, assess what are the risks related to environment and climate change for development, for social and economic development, but also try to assess what risks would be posed by some development sectors or areas for environment. For example, here is also the example from one of the CCAs, which shows that in terms of economic stability and growth as a risk area, and in relation to COVID pandemic, the country identifies that due to economic recession, there is a risk of decreasing social and environmental expenditures and investments, and so transition to green and sustainable economy. One another example, which is not in the slide, but I could mention, which is also not that obvious, that in a very good intention to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there is also which can be related, for example, with closing of mines or reducing the timber cutting. There could be social and economic risks in terms of increased unemployment and income generation. So this, I think there is a need to address also those risks. Here is an example from Undp social and environmental screening procedure, how you can measure your risks in terms of magnitude from critical to negligible, and in terms of likelihood from expected to only slight risks.
Thank you, Henrietta. So now let's do our first quiz question. While conducting a common country analysis, what tools we are suggesting to use to assess the linkages between environment, climate change, and national priorities? So there are 3 tools listed, and let's see if you can put your answers. So we wait for a couple of more responses, and then in the meantime, we will have a few minutes for questions for Henrietta for this part of the analysis that she presented. Great. Yes, the correct answer was matrix of synergies, and we overwhelmingly got it right. Henrietta also talked about stakeholder analysis, which is very important to bring those stakeholders together so that they can provide their views and insights of the linkages between environment, climate, and national priorities from different aspects. And as she talked about, not just from an environmental point of view, but also from an economic point of view, from social point of view, marginalization point of view. And then to what extent the risks are there can be assessed by risk assessment. So any question for Henrietta? Okay, because we don't have any questions and we have a very busy agenda for today, let's just go on with the second part of Henrietta's presentation, and then we will have more time for question, and also we will have the two kind of deep dives into the risk assessment and indicators and measurements. So there will be more space for you to ask questions.
Thank you, Livia. So now we are moving to the stage of cooperation framework document design, where you basically at the beginning confirm the key environmental and climate change risk and opportunities and objectives that you have identified and ideally quantified in the CCA, as I have mentioned. And you also identified in CCA the synergies between climate change, environmental issues important for the country, and your other so-called non-environmental development areas. So all this you would use to elaborate on in identifying your strategic priorities and theory of change, and then you would make it more concrete in elaboration of the cooperation framework results framework. So now we will stop a bit about at the design of the results framework stage. In terms of mainstreaming environment and climate change, it is recommended to do 2 steps to identify impact, mutual, how environment and climate change objectives and priorities for your country are mutually affecting or are affected by your non-environmental objectives and priorities. Here I have shown the example of the development priority related to governance, because this is usually less obvious. Like links between governance and environment and climate change are usually less obvious than when we talk about agriculture or energy or other economic sectors. So here in the table in a row, you can see one of the environment and climate change priorities of the country X, which is integrate climate change adaptation aspects into the relevant sectors, development policies, plans, and programs. And at the same time, UN country team has identified that improved governance is one of the strategic priorities, and one of the related outcomes is governance systems for improved participatory policy making. So how they mutually affect each other? There is likely positive effect of this outcome. They would be of this outcome on integration of climate change adaptation into mainstreaming into the planning, because if you generally improve your policy making and planning to make it more accountable, more transparent, more participatory, then is a bigger chance that you mainstream also other cross-cutting issues as adaptation and climate change into the policy making. Of course, you have to count also with the constraints, as is, for example, insufficient capacity for mainstreaming, which then you can translate into the interventions, and this could be then translated into the outputs or concrete projects. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is the second step, where you have identified that there is this link between mainstreaming adaptation and climate change and the governance. You would try to make sure that your governance outcome or output is actually cross-reference with the environment and climate change issue. You could do this 2 ways. You either identify environment or climate change specific outcome or output, or for example, it would be improve environmental governance, or you basically cross-reference and align your existing output formulation with environment and climate change. The slide shows the example where output 1, its original formulation was written in white. Inclusive national and local governance systems have greater resilience and capacities to mainstream gender mitigation. And you would include in the environment and climate change to stress importance of this issue, to ensure evidence-based and participatory policymaking map and address inequalities and deliver quality services to all. And you would make sure you identify proposed indicators, of course, those that you have a probability or you have ability to measure. For example, number of strategic development documents, national sectoral, that integrate the environment and climate change, also as other cross-cutting issues, or percentage of people with knowledge of their rights to free access to information, participation, decision-making, and access to justice, including in environmental matters. Cooperation framework implementation, mainstreaming in the implementation has two dimensions. One dimension is to integrate environment and climate change into the joint work plans, agencies, country programs, documents, and of course, very importantly, to programs and projects through which agencies implement their programs. But another very important aspect for effective and systematic mainstreaming is the institutional governance and capacity development system for mainstreaming that UN country team and UN agencies should introduce and implement. There are already agencies as UNDP or FAO, to my knowledge, that already have their systems for mainstreaming environment and climate change into programs and projects. I do not deal with the guidance with the mainstreaming at this stage, but whatever system the agency decides to use, there are 3 steps for mainstreaming into programs and projects. At first, you have to do the screening, so to check whether your program or project does at all have any linkages with environment and climate change. So you do not necessarily try to mainstream where there is no need. If there is a linkages, you assess the mutual environment and climate change impact of your project objectives and interventions. And if you find out that the impact is expected to be considerable, you identify how those risks and impacts would be managed within your project interventions. As I have mentioned, if the UN country team would be serious, and also UN agencies would be serious about environment and climate change mainstreaming throughout the whole programming process, there is a need to establish a system for it. I am on this slide, I am bringing up just few elements which would be important to consider when establishing some system. The very first step, important step, is that UN country team, UN agency commits, expresses commitment and has a strong leadership for mainstreaming. The second element is that you partner with you build the right partnerships and you involve the right stakeholders, as I mentioned before, at the different stages of the programming. For example, if one of your objectives is to improve education, it would be important that at certain stage, besides the authorities related to education, you include also environmental stakeholders, so they can help to integrate this aspect into the educational policies and system. Very important to have the right governance mechanism. The cooperation framework, the countries in their cooperation framework documents, they already propose their governance mechanisms, where usually one results group is devoted specifically to environment and climate change. But it would be good if the UN country teams think how to extend the role of that group, for example, to make sure that environment and climate change issues are also heard and incorporated into the work of the other results groups. It is necessary to continuously build capacity of the UN country team and national counterparts for mainstreaming. If all that works, then it should result in environment and climate change embedded in joint work plans and programs and projects. It is necessary to create the right funding framework. It means to allocate some resources also within the non-environmental outcomes and outputs and projects for addressing environmental and climate change, of course, where it is relevant. And last but not least, it is important to embed environment and climate change aspect into the monitoring and evaluation framework, into the reporting, and very importantly also to the communication, internal and external communication. Cooperation framework, monitoring and evaluation, mainstreaming would also have two aspects. At first, you would make sure that you assess progress and achievement of outcomes and outputs and targets related to the environment and climate change. Of course, the precondition for it is that when you were creating the results framework, you identified you formulated the right outcomes, right outputs, and indicators and targets, which allow you to actually measure the mainstreaming element. But also you assess how effective is the mainstreaming process or system that your country team set up. It's the one that I described in the previous slide. Here I would just conclude that this has to be part of both internal and external evaluation of cooperation framework of the UN country team. I would just add that in the guidance you have annexes, sort of information sheets, where you have examples of showing how environment and climate change interacts with the non-environmental development priorities and objectives usually identified in cooperation framework documents like economic development, trade, good governance, conflict and disaster reduction, education, health. They include also examples of indicators and response measures. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Henrietta. So the approaches and tools you got into in more detail in this webinar. In December, we talked at the high level just about the entry points. And of course, today we had a chance to look in more detail under each of the entry points. You do have questions about any of the slides that Henrietta talked about, do either send us a chat or raise your hand. But before we get to that, we have another quiz question here based on the second half, just to see, just to keep the wheels moving in our minds. And the question here is, when we're talking about the process of mainstreaming environment and climate change at the programs and project level, there are a number of steps that Henrietta kind of noted that are sequential in looking at programs and projects in more detail. Is it getting right into a full impact assessment, or is it make sense to do a bit of a screening level assessment of influences and links before that? So we'll give a few minutes for people to respond. While you're thinking about how to answer this question, also think about if you have a question for Henrietta. I know I do, and others from the IBCT may as well, but this is a chance for you from across the subregion to ask questions of clarification regarding the presentation. All right, so how are we doing here so far? We got a lot of people saying that we probably should start with a screening process first. Screening does offer just a sort of a quicker, rapid sort of assessment off the bat to really see the level of the interaction than before going into a sort of a more full-blown analysis of the impacts related of an issue on environment and climate change, or vice versa. So thank you very much. Questions, colleagues from across the region? All right, Henrietta, you were very clear, obviously, in your delivery of the information from the guidance documents. I think what we will do now is move, of course, now into a little bit more detail. So we've been sort of going into sequential levels of detail since December webinar, higher level, Henrietta's presentation at a more detailed level. And now in the next two sessions here, we are going to get even further into the details. As Livia mentioned at the start, we're not going to go into breakout rooms, but we're going to cover the same content in plenary as a full group. So the first topic that we're going to cover, we're going to spend about roughly 30 minutes on each topic. The first topic, we're going to look into more detail on analyzing multidimensional risks and linkages to inform the design and implementation of cooperation frameworks. We have a few case examples from the previous sub-regional workshops that we've had the last 2 weeks. We'll share those just to get the conversation started, just to allow you examples for what we've seen in other sub-regions, and you get a chance to share as well. And we also have some additional guidance too, going even sort of above and beyond what Henrietta presented. The next 30 minutes, we're going to spend focus more at the implementation and the design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation stage, looking at results, frameworks, and indicators. And again, there, Olivia will have some case examples just to sort of seed our thinking, a chance for you to share similar experiences or questions regarding results, frameworks, and indicators, and then some question and answer and maybe a bit of interaction, time permitting. We are going to get right now into interactive mode on the topic of risks and linkages. And so be ready to turn on your cameras if you can, and be ready to interact. We will seed the discussion. So I'm going to show, well, I want to move forward just a couple of slides here, I think, to the questions that we want to get to here. So think about this now, as you're listening to me go through a couple of examples that we heard from the previous webinars. I'd like you to think about and do share how you may have analyzed multidimensional risks or the linkages using a matrix of synergies or a cross-impact matrix in your cooperation framework process. And secondly, how did the results of that analysis, whether it was risks or just linkages, how did that inform your strategic priorities and outcomes in the design of your cooperation framework? You could share that sort of whole experience of the method and then what was the result. And then as a third question, think toward implementation. At the program and project level, that agencies, programs, and projects to help support the cooperation framework results. How in that process could you be using risk analysis and linkages analysis to support the cooperation framework? And we're going to go into a bit of discussion on that as well. So reflect on those questions, maybe even if you have your phone, take a photo of the screen so you have these questions handy beside you. And I just want to go back to a webinar we had 2 weeks ago, a sub-regional webinar we had in Central Asia. And we had a colleague from Uzbekistan, RCO, share their multidimensional risk analysis efforts that was featured in their CCA. So if you've had a chance to look at the Uzbekistan CCA, you will have seen a couple of things. You will have seen the 12-factor multidimensional risk analysis that you're accustomed to seeing, but you would also see some results from the Inform tool that is available. It's a really quite an interesting tool. If you've not had a chance to explore the Inform Risk Index that is online at the Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center, it provides a lot of interesting information, and Uzbekistan featured it here. Of course, when we're talking about risk reduction and even the disaster risk reduction, we have, I guess, 3 dials that we sort of work with. One is sort of the exposure and the hazard, And the other set of dials are the vulnerability and coping capacity for responding to issues. And that's how the Informed Risk Index is structured. So Uzbekistan just presented some of that information here, for example, and they have some of their exposure index that shows the droughts, of course, and you see floods appearing higher up on the screen here, that these are issues of exposure. These are hazards, and there is exposure to those types of issues. So from the natural issue, we got floods and droughts, and so climate change could be exacerbating that. I think some of the conclusions that they started to see from this analysis, that a gradual increase in the intensity and frequency of events like droughts, that there's significant risks to a lot of key drivers in the economy, and that threatens to reverse gains made in human welfare, and it may lead to possible deprivations in some of the sustainable development goals like SDG 11 if it's related to housing, water, SDG 6, food supplies, and SDG 2. And they also discussed greater levels of, other issues that could lead to in terms of loss of jobs. So they did kind of portray a lot of linkages just through their risk and through providing this additional sort of information on risk, which was quite unique, and it makes good use of the Informed Risk tool. So if you did have some experience with this index in your analysis, and if this helped inform, that would be good to share as well. So I encourage you to, while I'm speaking, to be thinking about examples from the region, because we do want to add to the stockpile, and particularly from the region here, colleagues here today, similar examples of your multi-dimensional risk analysis process, successes and challenges that you had. In the webinar that we had last week with the Southeastern Europe and Turkey sub-region, we had an intervention from Serbia, and Serbia talked about a number of aspects actually. One of them being their multidimensional risk analysis, where they did do the 12-factor analysis that is provided in the guidance for CCA, for creating CCAs. And I just note a couple of the areas on the screen there. Of course, one of the risk areas of the 12-factor framework is environment and climate change. And we do see here, of course, that this was, there were some very high likelihood and impact areas here that were noted in the CCA, and how that sort of helped inform the environment and climate change issues that were included in the cooperation framework. But notably also the public health risk area picked up on the linkage with air pollution. As you can see at the very bottom of the screen, air pollution, other pollutants affecting public health. So that's a sort of a classic linkage. Environment and development linkage is the human health through the air pollution, and the CCA picked up on that particular analysis. So there is just a couple of examples from the subregions. I think just to expand on the Serbia one a bit, I think looking into further detail on that, of course, their CCA revealed, their risk analysis revealed a few areas that were internal risks, of course, to the UN's capability in driving the SDG agenda. Of course, the EU integration process was top of mind in the Serbia country context, as mentioned in the CCA. And also a second was sort of the competition for limited financial resources in a really crowded development space. That was a key area that came out of their risk analysis. Of course, so as we've seen, a risk analysis not only can help identify those risk areas, but it also flushes out linkages, such as what would happen through a linkage analysis using a matrix of synergies, that type of thing. Public health and air pollution linkages as an example. So we do want to pause at this point and open the floor to colleagues from the region that would have something to share with regard to their efforts to analyze risks and linkages, and how that helped to inform the process for the cooperation framework. And it might be something that you're just currently involved in and that you're thinking about in your process, depending on the stage that you're at. So looking across the participant list, you have your hands up function at the bottom on your controls. Don't be shy. And you also have the chat space if you want to get our attention. And this is the chance to take advantage of you all being in the same room here virtually to start sort of a discussion of what you've been doing with regard to risks and linkages in the region and how it's been useful or the challenges you've had. I know there's a lot of interesting things going on in the region. I know from my past experience in working with the MAPS initiative, the Mainstreaming Acceleration and Policy Support out of the UN Sustainable Development Group. I know in past cycles, I know Moldova in past cycles when it was the Undp had done a lot of interesting things with regard to linkages, even using integrated modeling approaches in the past. I think Moldova's into a new cycle of the Undp, but if there's anything on the Moldova side that you want to share in terms of the current process you're going to, that would be certainly interesting. I know I'd find that super interesting, just knowing the interesting things that Moldova's done in the past. Anyone have an example they want to bring up? Okay, well, while you're getting warmed up and while you're getting the courage to raise your hand and share an experience, I'm just going to go into a bit more detail. And as I'm going through more slides, hopefully it triggers some examples that you want to share or convey, or some challenges that you've had in the mainstreaming process. And then that will, in fact, just snowball into another colleague of yours from another country that had done something similar and experienced a similar challenge, or perhaps even broke the barrier that was in their way. On the multidimensional risk analysis side, of course, there is the guidance in the CCA guidance document from the UNSDG that does provide some high-level guidance for doing multidimensional risk analysis. So that's obviously a starting point in terms of identifying risks that affect the development trajectory. Of course, the 12-factor framework was designed to help support that. A focus on the leave no one behind aspect in the risk analysis is obviously important. And that the risk analysis really gets to those drivers of risks, as we saw in the sort of the public health, air pollution, and economic growth linkages, and the root causes and proximate causes. So that's really a key part of risk analysis. And that guidance is there in the CCA. So that's obviously a starting point. Another helpful guidance that is out there when you're doing your multidimensional risk analysis, of course, is sort of keeping an eye on the hazards list. So the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has the UN General Assemblies set out essentially the hazard sort of classification review. And in that document, if you go to the annex of the documents, you get a really good list of 8 hazard types. And this is always a good sort of quick reference guide to help you think of where some of the risks might be to environment and development. And there are a number of environmental aspects here. There's, of course, broader aspects on this hazard list, getting into even to extraterrestrial hazards and the like, and also, natural disasters like volcanoes and earthquakes. But we've got the meteorological and hydrological hazards that, of course, are exacerbated by climate change. And we've got a number of environmental and chemical and also biological hazards that are highlighted. And the important part about this guide is it goes into more detail in that it provides under those 8 categories, another 47 hazard clusters. So a lot of detailed list of areas that can really perturb your development progress on results areas. So it's a very handy reference guide. I think an important point at this stage, and hopefully some of this does trigger also some thinking and some ideas that you might want to share in terms of your experience at the RCO and country team level. In the analysis of risks, or in just thinking of linkages such as a matrix of synergies, as Henrietta had shown earlier, where you do the sort of the 0-1 ranking of the extent of an influence of environmental issue on a development outcome or vice versa. It is a bidirectional analysis. And that's important to note, that changes in the environment and climate change can pose risks and opportunities for the achievement of strategic priorities and outcomes, and also even program and project objectives that are implemented through a cooperation framework. But there can also be, likewise, the achievement of priorities and outcomes and programs and project objectives can also then pose risks and opportunities for environment and climate change. So the analysis goes both ways, and that's quite important to remember. And I think another key part, and hopefully this also does trigger some ideas on your end, the implementation in the governance mechanisms, as Henrietta was alluding to, is really quite important at this stage, because that can help the mainstreaming at sort of at the implementation level, when the cooperation framework is really getting to the program project level of agencies. So for example, having a member of the Environment and Climate Change Results Group participate in the other results groups to assist with the analysis is really quite useful to do that. Of course, capacity issues always surface as a challenge. And we know we did hear that in the previous webinar in December, that one of the challenges of these cross-cutting, this mainstreaming is sort of the capacity to contribute to multiple results groups, to stay and have input into the other conversations. And that is a bit of a challenge, a bottleneck. I have a few more slides that I would like to go through, but I think I'm going to pause right here and just open it up again to anyone who wants to use the chat space down at the bottom to share a similar experience with either multidimensional risk analysis or the analysis of linkages, which I'll get into a bit more here in a bit. Henrietta, I think you're looking to elaborate.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please, participants, ask questions related to anything, but maybe just to stay within the governance area. I would be very interested to hear from the participants whether they themselves have an experience with addressing, when addressing governance type of the risks, linking them with impacts on environment. What governance issues, how governance issues in the country what risks can they pose, or opportunities can pose for environment and climate change, for example, especially in the sectors related to natural resources as a forestry, for like timber logging, or agriculture, where there is usually some level of corruption in those sectors, usually low level of political will, or not sufficient level of political will to change the directions, or there is a problem with open data, so there is no access to open data in those areas. Whether they have whether they have experience with linking those risks to the environment, to management of natural resources, or whether they think it's important, and maybe also whether they think it's challenging, because it usually can get quite political.
Yes, thanks for elaborating on the governance aspect, Henrietta, much appreciated. And thank you, Nicholas, for adding in a link in the chat space of a guidance document. In fact, I'm going to touch on that document here in a bit as well, too. So thank you for putting the link there. In the chat space, yeah, if you can add examples of environmental governance in the chat space, I think your colleagues would very much appreciate it, as your colleagues will appreciate anything that you share here, because the mainstream is, the guidance is meant to help with the process of mainstreaming, but you've been doing it in past UNDPs and the current new cycle of cooperation frameworks. And so the experience on an ongoing basis is key. And this is a really unique opportunity in the subregion here to have that conversation. So please do continue to think about things you would want to share with your colleagues, because they will certainly appreciate it. I know in the last two sub-regional webinars we've had in the last 2 weeks, we've had some good examples from the region to share. So it would be great to add to the stockpile. I'm going to move on and cover just a few more things here before we just so we can hand it move on to the next room and the next topic on results and indicators. But just some additional information. You saw Henrietta mention the UNDP social and environmental screening procedure. This is a really quite useful tool at the risk analysis level, especially so at the implementation level of a cooperation framework when we're talking about programs and projects, because it is a tool that is meant to be used at the program and project level. And it does help you think about risks. And as Henrietta showed very briefly, that they do provide a nice likelihood scale and a nice impact scale and definitions of levels of impact, low 1, high 5 in a table, which is extremely useful. And then they define a risk level map, which is the color-coded screen here I call a heat map. And they highlight that combinations of impact and likelihood levels then result in either high, substantial, moderate, or low impact. And this allows you to do, quickly generate a spreadsheet and to keep track of your risks, which is commonly called a risk register. And then that will allow you to track that information. So this is a very useful tool. I encourage you to look at this one, and especially the guidances that it has. As I mentioned, you could quickly create a spreadsheet with using the scales that the UNDP does in their area, and you could have your examples. You could have, let's say, the sort of the risk of a particular achievement of a program objective on different results areas. You could have results areas, for example, there's SDGs mentioned in this spreadsheet, but you could have different results areas that you look at for the achievement of different program and project objectives to really see that and screen out areas of programs and projects that may be counterproductive to other results areas. And this, I think the guidance, perhaps that this might be the guidance that Nicholas had sort of provided the link to, but the UNDR does have a guidance on mainstreaming climate change adaptation and DRR into cooperation frameworks. They have risk analysis guidance on page 23 and also linkages analysis guidance on page 26. And particularly useful is the information in Appendix 2, where they look and expand and elaborate on risks and risk areas for every sustainable development goal. Okay, question. We have Inga, thank you very much. Question being, a suggestion of how keep the balance while mainstreaming environment and climate change into other outcomes and not resulting into complete absorption of environment by other outcomes. Okay, this is interesting, and Henrietta, you want to reflect on this one, but just a very quick reaction on my side. So this is that gets, I think, to that area where it's good to have a particularly one sort of pillar on environment and climate change, because it then shows sort of the, it provides a bit of a foundation for how important and a foundational that environment and climate change. And so one pillar is great, and then, but to have the influence of environment climate change and the input into each of the results areas is really quite critical. And the ways to achieve that are obviously quite, maybe varied. I don't know if Inga, if you want, you feel free to turn your mic on in your video if you do want to share and elaborate directly. You can just intervene right now and turn your mic on in video. Please feel free to do so. But in the meantime, Henrietta, did you want to expand?
Yeah, I agree with what you said, and I think Inga is from UNDP, if I am not mistaken.
Yes.
Yes.
So here it becomes a challenge because UNDP, as unlike some other agencies that are more subject specific, could face this problem. But I agree with Darren that it's good to have an environment and climate change pillar and address issues, of course, those that are priority, but also those that the agency has a competitive advantage. And to allocate resources by mainstreaming into other development areas. We very often talk about making those areas kind of more sensitive towards environment and climate change. Very often we talk about opportunities. For example, if you have a project on open data, you are supporting open data in the country, so people have freely accessible information on actions of different government authorities, on spending of authorities. In terms of mainstreaming, it would be good if you expand that project, for example, with looking at whether people have the right to have information, for example, on air quality where they live, or whether they know they have this right, whether they know how to apply this right. So this would become only a part of that project. Technically, how this could be avoided, it could be already at the stage of CCA when you identify linkages between country-specific environment, climate change issue, and development priority issue. It is important that you use identification of these linkages in reflecting. You use these linkages to actually strengthen the synergies in your CCA, but at the same time to avoid duplication. So it depends already on the capacity and expertise and of your country office or agency, to what extent you address this issue within the environment and climate change portfolio, and to what extent you address it with for example, within the governance portfolio. In terms of CCA, if you reflect it sufficiently in all aspects in your environment and climate change section of your CCA, maybe there is no need to go into such details within your governance section of CCA, but it's good to make a reference to the issue. So this aspect is not forgotten throughout the whole programming process. I don't know if I have managed to answer.
Yes, Henrietta.
Please, Inga, yes, please do. Does that help? And how does, can you elaborate a bit on what you're maybe perhaps going through at the moment?
Yeah, thank you, Darren. Thank you, Henrietta. Unfortunately, I cannot show up myself. I want to say that we had indeed the same approach. So we felt like the CCA is that first step where we need to embed very strongly the environment, climate, and disaster aspects. And stemming from this document, we then would develop and we will step into the development of the United Nations country framework. That is why a special attention was given to the analyzing of the country context. And we used very largely the documents that UNDP and other UN agencies have prepared in relation to disaster risk, national disaster risk assessment, climate vulnerability assessments, and many others, so that the CCA is the data that are presented in the CCA are anchored in very thorough assessments, yes, and these data are the latest one. Also, we have, of course, used the approach of countries' commitments that it has on global and regional platforms. Because the mandate of the UN agencies is to support the implementation of these international commitments. That is why we as UNDP so suggested to work in parallel with these three streams in CCA, but also in United Nations country framework. And these were environment, these were climate change, and the disaster risk management. Yeah, thank you. I think I received the response to the question I had. And also I have put another question with regard to the environment governance. We would like to hear, because now we are at the stage of designing the outcome and outputs under the UNSDCF document. And while putting the environment governance there, and this output is always a part of the work that UN agencies are doing. The question was what exactly the environment governance means, because there are different interpretations of it. If we look into the European guidances, it's about strategic environment assessments, liability, it's access to environment information, and participation in the decision making and justice, environment justice. So I would like maybe you to suggest, do we take a larger approach to environment governance when including into other common framework documents, or we shall stick to certain definitions? Yeah, thank you.
Inga, thank you very much for elaborating too on your first question, and then also on the second one on the governance. Just very quickly before we do move on to room 2, I think you're correct. I think in this webinar too, we've been using the word governance a bit loosely, and it does that sort of a micro and a macro level to it. For example, if we use, maybe the word institutional mechanism is a little bit better when we're talking about how having an environment and climate change results group member participate in other results groups to help facilitate mainstreaming. Maybe that's a bit more of an institutional mechanism. It is governance related, but of course you're entirely right. There's the larger, bigger environmental governance question when it comes to managing environmental issues at a larger scale. And that's a bit of a different conversation. So thanks for highlighting that. I don't know if Henrietta, you want to just elaborate on that at all, very briefly, and then we'll have to move on to the next topic.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it's environmental governance is a very broad topic. I don't think it can be defined by one sentence or two sentences, as Inga has mentioned. Usually, in the more narrow sense, we refer usually to this strategic environmental assessment or environmental impact assessment and public participation, which are related to conventions at the regional level. But there could be much broader aspect, as you have mentioned, institutional reforms. Yeah, I have mentioned at the last seminar the example, very fresh example from Slovakia, where the forestry management is being moved from Ministry of Agriculture in the national parks, is being moved from Ministry of Agriculture to the Ministry of Environment of Slovakia to actually to decrease the forest cuts and to decrease the level of corruption in the forestry. And this is also one of the environmental governance aspects in a more broader context.
Great. Thank you very much, Henrietta. We do need to move on to the next topic area. You can add to the chat space. What we do want to encourage, we will move on to the next topic here, but to continue on with this, if you have ideas, challenges, or additional examples you want to share, we do want to sort of enhance the richness of the meeting report, and anything that you can share in the chat space, we will incorporate into the meeting report. And if it's a question, we will also attempt to address it in the meeting report as well. So ongoing chats for this first topic on risks and linkages. And you'll have the slides as well, as including the slide that's been on the screen here that shows just another scale for analyzing linkages. Livia, we're going to move on to room number 2 now.
Thank you, Darren. So for now, joining our not really working group, but a group work in this session, and we will be looking at the issue of measurement and indicators of what it means from a mainstreaming point of view. I'm going to project 2 slides on kind of a theoretical approach, 2 slides examples from the region or the regions that we've been working through these 3 webinars, and then we're going to do an exercise together. And I'm just giving a kind of a warning that the exercise will be very participatory, and I will be looking at the screen and asking you to jump in if we don't have people jumping in. So have ready your mic. You don't need to turn on your camera if you don't like to. Here it is 6:30 a.m. So I am without my camera, but I probably, had I been a participant, I probably wouldn't have turned on my camera. But so you are feel free if you don't want to turn on your camera, but I may call your name based on your name that is on the screen. So, but let's go to measurement and indicators. So first, just let's start from a very basic point of view, which is that we talked about the linkages between the country frameworks and SDGs and how important it is to think about environmental issues when we're thinking about social and economic development. And this is just a very simple picture about SDGs, which shows in green all the parts of the SDGs that have the environmental aspect, and all the parts in orange. Oops, this is my phone speaking to me. So in orange, those that are social issues. And what I'm just trying to show you is that no matter what kind of issue you pick, you always have a chance to find an environmental mainstreaming issue, as well as addressing issues around no one left behind, gender issues, marginalization. So when we think of SDG, for example, 1, SDG 3 that also Henrietta talked about, environmental pollution, SDG 4 on education. Here we can find very direct linkages to environment in terms of access to income, access to natural resource services through environment and their links to poverty, or let's say access to higher quality land for people impacted by poverty instead of working in marginal lands, and those type of things that has direct linkages to income and food security and nutrition. And on the other hand, when we think of other SDGs, for example, SDG 8 on decent jobs, we often know that people who are affected by poverty, marginalization, they often don't have decent jobs, they work in informal conditions, and all kinds of issues that, including in agriculture and other environmental sectors like forestry that we already mentioned, that may also have a lot of opportunity to integrate environmental issues even to that type of SDG. And there, let's say we have SDG 11 on community development, we can think of many, many environmental linkages. Access to water, disaster impacts, access to green spaces in cities. So there are a lot of linkages, and just by the SDG, how they are structured and issues that are prioritized help you to kind of think about these linkages right from the beginning. Now, these are there's 2 examples. So one is SDG 4, kind of thinking it a bit further on education, which is the obvious one that students are educated around climate change and environmental issues, not just basic biology, but also issues around global change, issues around desertification and other challenges. But from an economic development point of view, the other part of this discussion is also in terms of developing skills that we need, for example, for green transition, that we need for improved skills to be able to engage in energy transition, to engage in using different types of technologies that are coming from moving towards more sustainable economic development. So that also part, to have those kind of skills part of the educational system, not just kind of the basic environmental education. And same when we look at for decent jobs. So I talked about the issues around informal jobs and challenges in terms of access jobs in rural areas, and the linkages for either overuse of natural resources, so not having access to natural resources, for example, water that could be too expensive for many farmers. But in the same time, again, also when we are talking about new job creation in terms of transformation to a more, low carbon transition or improving energy efficiency, again, there are a lot of opportunities for not just the transition itself, but also job creation, and then ensuring that the people who we would like to get employed in these sectors, they have these skills, and what kind of jobs we are creating in this sector. So we can think of this type of more practical linkages in terms of when we are talking about the mainstreaming. So now I would like to share with you two examples on indicators, and then we move to the exercise and we work together. So in terms of the two examples, one example is from Georgia, and on the bottom of the slide and online, you will be able to see the link. For some reason, it disappeared from my slide, but it's on the slide deck that will be uploaded. And so basically, we are looking at, because we know the old saying says what is not measured is not managed. So maybe that's a bit of an overstatement, but what Henrietta also talked about, that if we don't ensure that there are indicators that measuring the issues around environmental issues that are being mainstream from the environmental or climate change perspective, or issues around gender or leave no behind principle, we may not actually at the implementation level deal with these issues. So, and how to kind of make through the process, go from top down, is really that we have indicators that cover these issues. And so on the left, we can see a focus on greater resilience and capacities to mainstream gender issues, and also addressing migration issues and promoting evidence-based policymaking. So part of this indicator set under these outcomes, we can see that we have issues around measuring women's participation in diverse sectors. We have women's land ownership, which we also mentioned, and other types of indicators coming mostly from SDG 5. Now here, because we talk about also promoting greater resilience and improved capacities, we don't have any type of environmental indicators here, and it may not be necessary in every case, but we could think about, when we, let's say, talk about land ownership by women, there we can go further and look at, let's say, access to women's farmers to different types of environmental services, and access to different types of, for example, extension. On the other side, we have the issues that focuses on promoting resilience through improved environmental governance, climate actions, and sustainable development. And here, there are a number of interesting environmental indicators that can be considered relevant for your mainstreaming efforts. For example, the most obvious one, and that also has been mentioned earlier, are related to diseases related to different environmental issues such as water, air pollution, soil pollution. Then, of course, the one type of indicator that's very typical and also has been mentioned, which is about number of different policies that are focusing on the issue. Of course, we all know that policy development is probably the easiest part of the process. Implementation is a lot harder, but at least having an understanding if there are policies that address the issue. Now, for example, here it focuses on issues around food safety and agricultural transformation, can provide important indication that there, at least there's a good basis to start the mainstreaming process at the implementation level. Also, one interesting indicator you can see, which is the combination of leave no behind principle and environmental issues, looks at gender sensitive municipal hazard and plans and preparedness plans. So this is kind of that manage to bring together both issues, but often we cannot really succeed to have one indicator that covers all the aspects. So in terms of how we can think about the designing an indicator set to cover the outcomes, we can think of kind of three types of indicators. First, we have an indicator, and it's listed on the top of the slide, an indicator that measures the overall trend of an outcome. So here we may be hard time to integrate environment and gender issues or leave no behind principle right away, but we have an indicator that measures the trend. For example, the state of agricultural productivity could be then. Then we can have another indicator that looks at the gender and leave no behind principle, which for example would be farmers that operate on marginal land or farmers that are impacted by poverty and their situation in engagement in agricultural productivity. And then we have an indicator around environment and climate change component of the outcome. And here we can look at, for example, the use of water. We can use of different techniques that improve soil management and things like that. As I said, sometimes we can succeed to bring all these three elements together, but sometimes we don't. And why we don't, there's the other issue that I would like to say is the data challenges. When we mainstream, we often bring issues that are usually not naturally part of the outcome, or we not naturally think about them as part of the outcomes. And often the indicators or the measurement systems are designed in a very rigorous, strict way. They are often kind of a multi-year data collection effort, which is on one hand good, but from another perspective, it's not that good because it's very hard to address issues that are a bit different. There are too many disciplines involved. Bringing environment, social issues into a measurement system. So therefore, we are also limited by data challenges. And that's why when we look at some of the indicators, we can think we could have had better ones, but sometimes we definitely face data challenges. Let's take another example, which is the example from Georgia. And again, I picked two thematic areas, one related to access to social services and policies. And you can see in outcome 1, 2, we have indicators. There is definitely a specific issue of addressing the differences in access for men, women, boys, and girls. And also there is issue around accessing social protection and access to healthcare services. So when it comes to indicators, so the first indicator talks about coverage of essential health services. This is basically a generic indicator that would describe the issue that we are focusing on. And now when you look at the other levels, they look at the issue of levels of access to certain services, and there's also an issue of migrants accessing certain services, which the migrants actually would indicate that there is at least some consideration around leave no behind principle in this case. Often, how we consider these principles is also at the level of targets. Let's say in this example, there are many good targets. And here we can see that at the level of targets, let's say the gender differences or other income differences are considered. And that way also the indicators can reflect on leave no behind principle or environment by having a target that is specified in these terms. The second example we hear is looks at access to economic development. And here we are looking at the access of vulnerable groups to have to decent work, to take part in economic development, and also that is done in a way that is resilient to climate. So when we look at these in terms of vulnerable groups and access to employment at the level of indicators, this is translated by having the proportion of youth and later there's also gender, but an example could be a proportion of youth that is engaged in education or not engaged in education, and how we can engage them in employment or training. Similarly, here we can also have a spatial aspect, because there are some places when youth or people are more vulnerable than other places. Let's say in capital, it's much easier to find a job than in certain regions. So how, let's say, the portion of youth that is not in education is not just reflected in a general number per country, but also in vulnerable regions. The other part is also in terms of environment. There is an indicator that provides details about the level of air pollution that again links to health issues and an overall quality of life. And there is also the kind of our usual indicator that we often cite, which is the adopted mitigation and adaptation policies in terms of indicating the the issues around climate change. It's a bit generic indicator, but it's one of the things that as I already mentioned, it's easier to measure. So therefore, when we're looking at addressing indicators on mainstreaming, we are trying to find the balance between relevance and availability, because those indicators that or ideas for indicators that may seem very relevant might be very hard to find data. So we are trying to measure this balance. And the other part is that when we are actually searching for indicators, we can rely on international or national databases. So we have the SDG indicator database, which is the easiest kind to work with, but it's often very generic. So we can find some indicators for some issues, but not for others. There are also other global indicator databases that you are, I'm sure, using of World Bank, FAO, and other UN agencies. There are the national data sources that are often published in statistical yearbooks or in online in statistical agencies. And finally, for specific local issues, you can also use local data sources. But so that kind of how the data is accessible is then limit our way of what indicators we can design. So we can go as far as the data kind of allows us. So now what I'd like to do, and now we have a space when we can have a quick discussion through a very specific example. So we are going to do an example together. And here, on taking an exercise basically on specific regional priority, and we try to design indicators that would account for the aspects of environmental and the integration of leave no one behind principle. In order to do so, we have on my screen at this point 28 participants. So I'm just going to, feel free to jump in and I'll type up our answers, or I will try to call you based on your name on the screen so that you can share your experience. We can imagine a hypothetical country that is developing their country framework document, and it tries to address how to measure mainstreaming issues for environment, but also around gender or social inclusion in this situation. So let's first start with what the sustainable economic development outcome would be. So in this kind of hypothetical Central Asian, Southern European country, what would be when we say we would like to promote sustainable economic development, what that would be? We touched on energy transition, we touched on environment, agriculture, we touched on pollution issues. So in order to start the indicator process development, we need to be specific. So what would the sustainable economic development issue would be? Alper, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Livia, and thank you everyone for this illuminating presentation. I'm immensely benefiting from this. And my name is Alper. I'm from the regional DCO. So my hands are not that much dirty as the colleagues in the field. So I try my best to brainstorm with everyone. So but I can say the likely effects of the sustainable economic development. So I'm going to touch upon agriculture, maybe.
Okay.
So I can say that most likely result and effect would be having a resilient agricultural system. In other words, for example, like having an improved or enhanced irrigation systems for the country, which might pave the way for increased food security for that country, and maybe maybe triggering or not triggering, maybe supporting the production of climate resilient crops. So again, this item would also lead to increased food security, and eventually this is going to contribute to the sustainable economic development. So this is just a quick contribution from my side.
Thank you. No, this is very good. Yes, so one of the kind of the agricultural change that we are often needing is the resilient agriculture, which often manifests itself with improved irrigation, or need to invest into improved irrigation. And in this column, we have basically the possible implementation projects that we can think of achieving the sustainable economic development. So improved irrigation would be definitely investment into improved irrigation would be also right away one of the projects or priority areas of investment. Okay, so now let's just elaborate in this a bit further. So we have an improved irrigation system, which would be one of our sustainable economic outcomes. Also, that we are basically producing more crops that are climate resilient. What else we would like to have in this part of that resilient agriculture? Can somebody jump in, please? Yeah, so we talked about the kind of the performance of the land, but what about other issues? What about employment? What about providing support in terms of needing? What about who will pay for the irrigation system? How much it would cost? So any more details on the resilient agriculture? You also mentioned in your registration about land conservation concerns. So how about that would play in the resilient agriculture?
Yeah, I was Livia Darren here. I was thinking that too, because the land degradation was one of the most commonly mentioned issues in the registration process. So that might and there may be an angle to that.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just call on, yeah, we have Alper, so let's give chance to somebody else, and if not, then we jump to Alper. So maybe just one sentence, Alper, just because it was your idea, so maybe you can just chip in quickly.
Okay, I just want to trigger, so
yes.
Maybe like land, like soil conservation, so sustainable agriculture practices. I mean, there are some countries, they are heavily suffering from soil salinization, like the soil is extremely polluted. So the sustainable agriculture practices, which might bring about resilient agriculture, can contribute to the cleaning the soil, if I may say. I don't know how to say in a technical way. Decrease the salinization of the soil. Yeah, this could be another contribution.
Yes, thank you. So what about now, because we are getting the land part of the agriculture done, you know, we have better crops, we irrigate more, we conserve soil. Now what on the other side, on the side of education, on the side of employment, on the side of vulnerable groups, and then we jump into indicators. So can somebody just elaborate maybe on that angle, what we put there into our sustainable economic development view?
I think you may add, may I jump in here?
Yes.
You may add indicator on increased competitiveness of small agricultural producers, farmers.
Okay, that's a very good point. So we need to invest into increased competitiveness of smallholders. Mm-hmm. Very good. And we'll jump to the indicators right away. So what about in this angle now, we touched on smallholders that are often marginalized in the agricultural production. So what about employment or education?
In general, you can also actually increase competitiveness of small farmers. It's also related with education, access to innovative and energy efficiency practices and so on, yeah. But I was thinking also in terms of decent employment in agriculture, because it's usually also related with environmental issues such as safety, yeah, safety and security, yeah.
That's a very good point, because when you often think about decent employment in agriculture, we often think about in terms of informal employment and those things, but that which is related to your point, but it's also actually a safe access to tools, safe access to chemicals, and it also has a health impact, not just kind of the contractual impact. Yes, so it's both the income and the health. Okay, so anybody else would like to add something more on this vision of resilient agriculture in the region? And if not, we jump into indicators. No. Okay, so I'm not really, because we are short on time, so I'm not, I'm cutting the spaces. So let's go to indicators. So we said we would like to have an agriculture that has improved irrigation, food security, climate resilient crops, access to jobs, and smallholders, better situation for smallholders. What kind of indicators we can have here? So let's think an overall indicator of view on resilient agricultural system, what that would be. We have Henrietta. Anybody else from the participants?
We have nice SDG indicators, yeah, for this. First of all, the proportion of agricultural land used sustainably, yeah, sustainable.
Yes, the 2.4.
Yeah, 2.4. Yeah, I don't remember the number right now.
That's a very good on sustainable production. Okay, so what else?
On food security. Of
yes,
course.
the food security is very good point. Food security is actually quite well set indicator, and it's well measured in many countries, 2.1, and also we could think of 2.2, which is the nutrition. Okay, so now let's touch on the irrigation, what we would measure when it comes to irrigation. And now we're having the issue of environment front and center. What we would be the issue of irrigation, how we would measure, what we would like to measure. Please.
Maybe number of hectares.
Yeah, now a number of hectares that are irrigated. Okay, that's a good idea. What else?
Maybe improved agricultural production, like meaning that if the irrigation system is improved, which means that agricultural production will be improved, like maybe like in the proportion of the agricultural production increased.
Yes, and that's a good point, because agricultural production and improvements, it's also kind of an overall indicator that will measure the trend for this whole cluster of priorities.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe also
yes?
the health relation.
Yes, exactly.
Like for example, if possible, the quality of surface or groundwater in certain area, and then if a data exists, also the level of incidence of waterborne diseases, if such data, this would be related to using the chemicals in agriculture.
Yes, and that's also a very good point. And here, because we are incorporating also the regional aspects, so we can also look at the mainstreaming issue, not just the inequality in terms of in the whole country, but kind of zoom down in at least some sub-regional places where this thing could matter. Because often when you have a national data, the incidence can be very small, but in some specific regions, it can be very big. Okay, so we touched on the overall trend in the sector, which is the the land in sustainable production, the agricultural productivity. We touched on the issue of hectares that are being irrigated, environmental health issues, and kind of related inequality. Should we look something around at least one or two indicators around employment and smallholders that are often disadvantaged? And so to address also the inclusion.
Maybe proportion of female landowners.
Yeah. Or engagement of women. Or women engaged in certain type of services, like the extension, technological support, and other type of services that would need to happen to make this transition. Any other indicator? Now we don't really have any specific indicator on climate change related impacts and adaptation issues. We kind of have the water and the irrigated land, which implies that if we have less water, we can irrigate less. But
also there is possible to have proportion of small farmers using sustainable, resilient, agricultural practices.
Yeah, so we can have the hectares of irrigation land and use of modern irrigation, but here we can also have the small farmers engaged in using technology and irrigation. Because one thing is for the big farm, and it's much more challenging for the small farm. Okay, yes, and I'm just down here in extension and access to.
Actually, it's not only in irrigation, it's also energy efficiency and using solar energy. And this is directly linked with climate change.
Yes, and there's the other thing which we haven't really touched earlier is that where the energy comes into the agriculture. We talk about where the water comes in, but also the energy source in agriculture and how much comes from a greener option for agricultural production, which could be solar or better type of kind of energy that used to run the machinery and things like that. And I think we are just getting at the end of the session. So I think I'll just type this and we will save this and we will put this as part of the wrap up from the session. I would like to thank you now for all of you for joining the session and participating with me.
All right. Yes, we can now. Yeah, Livia, we can move on to closing remarks, and then I can set up the evaluation poll. Mariana, you can proceed. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. Dear colleagues, on behalf of the IBC on Environment and Climate Change, I would like to thank you for your participation in today's training. And as you know, the supporting countries in environmental dimension of SDCF and CCA processes is one of the 3 core pillars of the IBC's work. As was mentioned in the opening, both the mainstreaming guidance and the training were developed in response to requests by resident coordinators and also the interest expressed by yourself and other colleagues in UNCTs during the launch of the mainstreaming guidance last summer. So we're very pleased to have been able to offer this training today, and also the one that we had earlier in December that was a pan-regional one. We appreciate your interest and your participation. Since the guidance for cooperation frameworks was developed, many UNCTs finalized their new cycle of SDCFs over the past 2 years, and also some examples of good practices and experiences of mainstreaming environment and climate issues in SDCF were included in the guidance that you all have with you. We hope that this experience sharing is useful for you, and especially for those country teams that are rolling out new SDCF right now. We encourage the regional coordinator offices and the country teams to use the guidance at the relevant stages of the SDCF process that they're currently on, and also if there is a need for a follow-up support on how to mainstream some very specific environment and climate issues at the country level in the process that you are engaged in, the IBC is available to support this process, and we would very much welcome requests for such support to be sent to us via the TCO. As Nick mentioned at the opening, this event was recorded, and all the materials, including the summary report from the webinars, will be available in the coming weeks. We will share the links with you, and the information and materials will also be on the IBC website. And we appreciate if you could circulate those materials to other UN colleagues at the country level that you think this would be interesting to. We will also email you a certificate of participation in appreciation of your engagement in the trainings. And Darren will explain in a minute a feedback process, and we very much welcome your feedback on the workshop. And your evaluation and suggestions will be important to improve future events and the workshops that the IBC may develop. I would like to thank our facilitators from IASD, and also to thank very much Henrietta for designing and delivering today's training, and to thank my colleagues in the IBC team who worked on the workshop. Thank you again for the continued engagement with the IBC, and we're very much looking forward to continuing work with you, and have a lovely afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you very much.